When parents force their kids into extreme tutoring sessions that are the equivalent of full-time jobs, that is when it has gone too far. That is when these kids' mental health is just deteriorating, and that is when they experience burnout that they cannot recover from. Three things in the speech. Firstly, 3 points of setup, then a point on why this narrative is inherently false and inefficient, and finally a point on why this narrative causes mental health problems and burnout. So 3 points of setup. I think firstly that that this narrative encapsulates the idea that suffering is virtuous and is necessary for success. This looks like the 996 work culture in China, where workers are expected to work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, and that is considered hard, but it's a part of success, and they're expected to do this by their employers. I think secondly, the counterfactual is likely to is likely to look like you try and put in effort, but it's not a no pain no gain mentality. You're more likely to pursue passions, and failure and asking for help is particularly acceptable. I think finally, there is an important distinction between working hard and suffering. So now on to my first point of why the narrative is inherently false and inefficient. I think there's just one point of setup here, and that is in cultures where there are these expectations that you should suffer in order to achieve success, particularly the Asian cultures, especially in China and Japan. All right, you are expected to follow this. Your family has brought you up living on this expectation. From a child, you are pushed into extreme tutoring. You are pushed into doing sports as basically a full-time job on top of school, on top of everything else, because your parents think that that doing this hard work, making you suffer, is part of how you achieve success in the future. So I think the reason why this narrative is just inherently false is because when you're it's because it kind of forces people and children to enter difficult pathways, for example medicine or law, when they're choosing their future careers, as they are seen as the difficult ones, and that is seen by their parents as desirable because it comes with the pain and suffering that follows. No matter how passionate you are about the arts, no matter how much you want to act or do something else, your parents push you into these pathways as children because they view them as the really hard ones that you suffer in, which is why that is so desirable. I think also just when parents or employers see their kids or employees suffering during work or during a football tryout or during an exam or a tutoring session, they blame it not on they blame it on how hard the kid or employee is working. That is to say that when a kid gets 96% on a math test instead of the 100 that they were expecting, they are punished for it because they're viewed as not working hard enough. Oh, you should have spent 30 minutes less on that on your screen and should have instead studied for that math test. I think that is the type of mindset and attitude that comes with this inherent social norm, and that is extremely painful. That is extremely harmful because obviously these children are obviously working as hard as they can. I'll take the POI now.
Do you think that this narrative is only prevalent in Asian communities, as you say?
I don't think it's only prevalent in Asian communities. I think it's quite widespread, especially in capitalist economies, because employers do try to force their workers to go as far as possible, and I'll explain that later. But I think it is quite prevalent in Asian communities, and I'll explain so later. I think you are likely to embrace. I think finally the reason why this narrative is inherently inefficient is because you are likely to embrace the suffering without thinking twice. That is to say, if you have a way of doing something, but it takes a lot of effort, you just head down and do it without thinking of if there's a more efficient way to do it. And I think that is one of the impacts of this norm. I think the impact of this is just you pursue careers and opportunities that you are not passionate about, just the ones that you consider difficult and the ones that you think you will suffer in, and that is extremely harmful because A, you don't do your passions, but B, it's just inefficient for everyone because you're not necessarily good at it, you're not necessarily enjoying it, and it's just really painful. But then you head into suffering without thinking about the efficiency. You don't think about ways you can cut corners and save some time. You just head down and you think, oh, I'm suffering, so I'm obviously going to succeed later on. I think the weighing of this is extremely bad because alternative narratives you're more likely to pursue your passions rather than what is socially popular, and you should it's more of a culture of you should try hard, but giving up is acceptable, and that is extremely important. Now onto my second point of this narrative causing mental health problems and burnout. I think there are 3 points of characterization. Firstly, when there is a social expectation to do something, especially in Asian communities, your family and friends pressure you to continue through pain, even when it is not productive or enjoyable. This is romanticized, and some famous examples, as I said before, are the 996 in China. And like when you fail, they point to like hardworking, like famous athletes or famous people, like businessmen, and they say that, oh, these people suffered, you should too, to get to their level of success. I think secondly, the second point of characterization is just like, like you overwork, because it's like, because when you overwork, not getting enough sleep or rest is like bad for you. And I think finally, like there are some expectations to handle these pressures or burdens by yourself without outside help, as you don't want to appear weak. And that is extremely harmful. I think the reason why this causes mental health problems and burnout is quite simple. I think when you have a cultural pressure to work hard through pain, you are likely to do so because you are pressured to do so by your family. You are likely to take on this pressure alone. I think this enables exploitation from companies because there is an expectation that you must work hard through your pain. You don't take holiday breaks. You do exceeding amounts of unpaid overtime because that is seen as like working hard and like the social norm to do so. I think parents are likely to put extensive pressure on their kids to do things that they don't want to. That's like doing like 40 hours of tutoring a week before like selective tests in Australia, for example. And I think that is, you should weigh this extremely highly because kids like cannot consent to this, and they're the ones that like are like mentally weak because they are developing. You should weigh them extremely high in this debate, and they're the ones that suffer the most of this burden. I think the impacts of just like these mental health problems are you burn out, right? You're so tired, you don't want to get up, but you get up anyway the next morning and continue suffering. You don't take a sick day when you are extremely sick because that is like seen as the suffering. That's part of the suffering. And you go to work the next day. I think there's huge amounts of pressure to like on kids to succeed. And that is particularly harmful because they are vulnerable, as I've stated before. But when they don't succeed, they feel as if they're not loved. They're not like valued as human beings. Their parents don't care for them. And that is extremely bad. I think the most famous example and the most simple example of like this is just Japan, right? Japan has this extremely famous like example of work culture, working to 3 a.m., getting up early, doing 6 days a week, right? But Japan also has the highest suicide rates because people are just not happy, right? When Japanese kids like grow up, they are pressured to be successful, and when they like eventually not, they just like it's just an extremely harmful narrative. And I think this is like a representation of extremely negative mental health issues that do come attached with this. And I think like the counterfactual is when you don't have these expectations, it is much better because you will pursue like careers that you enjoy more. You pursue things that you like more, right? So you burn out less, you enjoy them, you're more willing to do them, you feel more happy. And I think that is what government is arguing for in this debate. Never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
I think something that what proposition gets very wrong in this debate is primarily where these narratives are dominant and where these narratives exist. So here's a few key points of clarification and framing that I'm going to bring up. First, why does this motion exist? Because it's important at least somewhere and predominant at least somewhere. Second, where is this not going to be important? We say Western liberal democracies and where people are at least somewhat privileged or have their like basic needs met. Why? And we think, okay, why? Because this is much more prevalent, third point of framing, in poor marginalized communities, because they are the ones who undergo the most amounts of suffering, the vastest amounts of suffering. For example, food insecurity. For example, discrimination. For example, having to work thousands of times harder to get the same returns as someone in Western liberal democracy. And so what are the actual narratives that are more prevalent in Western liberal democracies or capitalistic societies, as they say? We think it's things like min-maxing. We think it's things like working smart and not hard. We think it's things like exploitation, because suffering happens to a much smaller extent on their side, because you have resources and connections and all sorts of things that push you through society, make sure you are able to live, and thus you suffer much less than people who need this narrative the most. Fourth point of framing, we think that being able to survive under these dire environments is actually a success in itself, right? It's like if you are food insecure, being able to live and for yourself and being able to survive, we think that is a win. Fifth and final point, we think that poor marginalized communities matter the most in this debate. Why? Because they intuitively have the hardest path to success, and they suffer like the most, and they have the most to gain from this narrative. And that is why we think that this debate should be focused on them. All right, now let's just look I'm going to do a few points of external rebuttal now. Okay, the first thing they say is that you can't pursue your passions if there's a culture of suffering. Sure, we aren't saying it's bad that obviously we aren't saying you can't ask for help. We aren't saying that you can't fail. We're saying that you have to overcome these things, right? You have to overcome failure. You have to push through the failure in order to grow. And also we say that if you want to pursue your passion, even in Western liberal democracies, there is a certain level to suffering to it, right? There are things like starving artists. And if you do something, for example, that you are passionate about, for example, I really like philosophy, I'm probably going to go broke, right? That's going to lead to a very large amount of suffering on their side. But you still have to push through it. And that's what allows you to still want to pursue your passions in the first place, right? And the second The second thing is, I think, in the last bit of their speech, they talk about suicide rates in Japan. I just want to gloss over this really quickly. The suicide rates in Japan are not because of suffering. They are because of the monotony and the unfulfilling nature of their job, because they work in the office and all they do is fill out Excel spreadsheets all the time. This is not, I would not say this is suffering. I would say this is just boring. And monotony is still, like in Western like capitalistic society, still a pretty big cause of suicide. Now, on to my substantives. First, why does this matter in marginalized communities, and why should this is this something that works? There are multiple, okay, I want to point out that there are multiple narratives in society, right? For example, you're being smart about choosing the right things, et cetera, et cetera. So why does this suffering narrative become dominant in these marginalized or poorer communities? It's because the neighborhoods or areas that are poor, like, they're neighborhoods where people work for years with no avail. And this kind of response is a response to the conditions that you face. It's to be able to help you work through it, right? To say you have to endure in order to get out or to survive in the first place. And this has proven to be effective, right? People have seen evidence of success from such narratives, and that's exactly why there is a predominance. For example, Ronaldo, he grew up in just abject poverty, right? His father was an alcoholic, his mom worked 2 jobs, he could barely survive. The whole reason why he is so successful today is because these conditions drove him to work hard. These conditions said, I need to make sure that my family and my mom is able to live a good life. I need to be able to push through this suffering. I need to be able to work hard and go through it in order to succeed and bring my bring returns back to my community. And that is why he is such a success story. Or in China, which they like to point out, if you are from a small village, for example, like Todd's mom, apparently, the only chance you have is to study so hard that you undergo immense stress and levels of physical suffering in order to, for example, do well in a Gaokao, go to a good university and build your career in the city and bring your family and bring your community out of that oppressive environment. So we say that this narrative very often is what alleviates suffering to a much larger scale. And so what does Prof now has to justify? They must justify why this narrative doesn't work for these marginalized communities and why it is bad. And we think that's very hard to prove. I'll take a point now. 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm going to guess there's no point. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about is how you are able to build the resilience and character needed in order to be able to succeed. We think that often if you don't follow this narrative, right? We think that people will often like especially in these dire conditions, they will revert to thinking that there is no hope. There is no point in enduring, especially when the suffering seems unending, and it often is, right? Your living conditions are very, very hard to change. So when you don't want to go through the suffering and the hard road, what are you going to do? You're going to turn to the easy way out. This usually looks like drastic measures that end up having even worse outcomes. For example, suicide. For example, joining criminal gangs, violence. This is why, for example, in African American communities, there's petty theft because they are still ingratiated in the Western liberal democracy, where the suffering narrative isn't talked about as much, but rather work smart, right? No, not anymore. You lost your chance. So they feel the need to be able to do things like petty theft in order to survive, right? And also we think that in these sorts of poor communities, especially in developing countries that are like, they're very likely to be things like religious. They're very likely to be like cultural elements. And we think that there's also going to be a narrative that, for example, if you don't work hard, then karma is going to get you back. For example, if you don't work hard, then that means you're disrespecting the kind of conditions that you're going through. We think that that means you're being lazy. And that's why, for example, there's going to be divine retribution that says you are not going to get what you deserve. Because note, and so we think that this actually pushes you to work harder. And because empirically, this is what alleviates suffering the most. This is what makes sure that people in these marginalized and suffering communities are able to survive. This is the most important, and this works. What are the 2 impacts I have? First, either you give up and consign yourself to suicide or isolation because as we said, in order to survive in the first place, you still have to endure suffering. You still have to go through that in the first place. Or second, you resort to crime and violence, which also in turn harms other people and is even less utile than, for example, taking mental health breaks or whatever Prop is going to try to push. So now, what has Prop's burden become? It's not that that's not that you become sad. It's not that you become stressed, but it's why this narrative is effective. Yeah, they have to prove that why this narrative is not at all effective, is not at all true, and is actually harmful to these communities that have crucially benefited the most from the narrative of needing to push through your suffering, to push through your living conditions in order to alleviate you, in order to lift up your family and get the returns that you need. So proud to oppose.
Judge, before my team entered this competition, both my teammates were told by their parents, make sure you win. My parents simply told me, good luck and have fun. I'd like to ask you the question, who do you think entered this competition with the better mindset? The fact is, the culture of suffering and the culture of this working long hours mentality creates stress, burnout, and undesirable conditions. Firstly, I'll go into rebuttal and then I'll move on to substantive. So my rebuttal. So the opposition has their main focus in this case on poor people. They say that people can work hard and get out of poverty. However, I'd like to simply refute this. Poor people aren't poor because they don't work hard enough. It is because the system has failed them. To tell poor people you just need to work harder to escape poverty is just so backwards. The fact is, there is systemic challenges against poor people. You can't just tell them that having a hard-working culture will make them raise themselves out of poverty, because we know in nations such as China, in nations such as Japan, where they have these cultures, there is still extreme poverty. For example, justifying that, saying that the Gaokao provides different opportunities for people in very small regional rural villages to be able to raise themselves out of poverty is just insane. Justifying the 0.001% coming out of poverty with the burden of their whole village is unfair. To say that this is the rule when it is not. It is a very rare exception when people from backgrounds of poverty are able to escape poverty through measures such as the Gaokao. The people who perform best in these tests, in these standardized tests, are the ones who have access to be able to get tutors, to be able to get extra help, to be able to have parents that can help them with the work. It is simply proven time and time again that standardized testing doesn't pull people out of poverty because it is an unfair metric of distribution. The fact is that the opposition has essentially told us that, oh yes, if you work hard enough and if you're pressured hard enough to work this hard, that you can eventually escape poverty. However, this is simply untrue in the fact that the opposition is juvenile in their belief of the meritocracy when it has been proven time and time again that it does not work. They moved on to try to refute a thing about Japan. They talked about how there is monotony in work in Japan, and I'd like to say that there is an expectation to take stable pathways of work. When people have been forced by their parents or forced by their communities to study for 80 hours a week, they are being forced to take more quote unquote stable career paths or to work harder than that. When people want to leave this monotonous job or whatever, they are often forced not to. They're saying that they're not working hard enough if they don't find passion in their job, and simply just saying that is unfair. So I'd like to now move on to my substantive, which is why the counterfactual is better. So there is a saying, there is a word in Japan which is karoshi. It literally means death by overwork. When we value success as a quantitative measure of hours worked, we lose sight of the real goals in life. This debate stems down to whether we think that success should be taken as hardship, dissatisfaction, and unhappiness whilst maintaining a nice career title, or if success should be measured in how happy, how much of a loving family you have, and what satisfaction you find in the work that you do. Judge, there is two choices. You can either be rich and unhappy, or you can be happy and poor. I think I would always take the latter. The fact is, cultures with low working hours and strong emphasis on family and community over long working hours and purposeful suffering are happier. We all know Finland is the happiest country in the world, and that is because of their culture. It is because they have the 4-day working week or the 36-hour week. It is just simply unfair to be able to characterize that, oh yes, if you work hard enough, you can escape poverty. Because the fact is, not everyone is. I'll take the POI.
Okay, if you have given up on life and you are not able to get the food that you need to survive, what use are lower working hours?
I think it's simply unfair to categorize the fact that, oh yes, well, lower working hours will be more successful. The fact is, if you're living in a rural village in Africa, it's not because you'll work 80 hours a week, which will get you out of poverty. It is the fact that you were born into that community. There is a thing called the lottery birth system. You do not get to choose whether you are rich and poor in life. You do not get to work your way out of it in 99% of the cases. It is the fact that these people systemically do not have the opportunity to do so, no matter how they work. I'd like to point out that this is completely unfair to skirt the debate as, oh yes, poor people are going to be forced to work harder and thus they can bring themselves out of poverty. That is completely untrue. That is completely wrong. And I believe in my speech, I have proved time and time again that this is simply not the case. So on top of this, the economic argument whether working harder is better and more productive for the economy. For example, in Japan, I'd like to say that workers will stay in their office even when there is no work left to be completed. This is because there is a negative culture about being the one to leave first, or being the one to leave the office before 12 a.m., or being the one to leave the office before their boss. The fact is, these cultures are not productive. The fact is that these cultures are extremely negative. When we define success in life, it should not be on the fact that we're vice president of technology of a random company. It should be the fact that we're able to look at our kids, say that we were attending their ballet recitals, the fact that we were able to attend all of your son's soccer games. It is not fair to say that we will trade this off just simply so that we can get a better title at work. The fact is, we, on our side, define success as finding happiness and satisfaction in what you do, not being and working 100 hours a week just for the sake of doing so and because of cultures. So I'd like to give you another example. For example, Adele prioritized her family over her career and is still wildly successful. Now, with only 10 seconds left until 6 minutes, I'd like to open the floor to any final POIs. Okay, so onto this Adele example. Essentially, she prioritized her family over her career and is still wildly successful. She took a break, she was able to rejuvenate, and she was able to thus produce better music. We see people in the arts industry all the time burning out because of the harsh working conditions. We see the casts of SNL have career spans of 1, 2, 3 years because they're working 90 hours a week just to pursue their passion, because it has been forced upon them, because it is the industry standard. This is simply unfair. You cannot define success when you feel like you do not have a life. The fact is, the basic purpose of human life is to find enjoyment in what you do. And if you are forced to work for every second of your life at the chance of escaping a certain future that has been forced upon you by systemic systems, then you are juvenile in your approach for that. The fact is, most under opposition's world, most poor people who work hard never are able to escape poverty. This is not because they're not working hard enough, but it's because of systemic disadvantage. Please do not listen to the opposition in this regard. Thank you. I'm so proud to propose.
So in the comfortable suburbs of developed nations, it is easy to look at the concept of suffering for success and call it toxic. It is easy to preach work-life balance and mental wellness when the safety net is strong and the path to a decent life is full with opportunities. But for the vast majority of human history and for the vast majority of the world's population today, success is not a matter of self-actualization. It is a matter of survival. When we strip away the narrative that suffering has purpose, that leads to glory. We do not liberate people. We disarm them. We take away the only psychological shield they have against a reality that is fundamentally harsh. First, let me clarify our stance. We're not arguing that suffering is good in a vacuum. We are not fetishizing pain. We are arguing that the narrative, the story we tell ourselves that hardship is a necessary price for achievement, is a vital survival mechanism. Prop wants to wish away the struggle, but we recognize the struggle exists and defend the tool that helps people endure it. Okay, now let's look at what Prop has argued. First speaker has told you that this narrative causes mental burnout and exploitation. They paint a picture of a corporate worker staying late in an office in Japan, destroying their mental health for a promotion that will never come. This is a privileged characterization. It assumes that the alternative to suffering for success is healthy success.
Point of information.
No, in the context we care about, such as impoverished communities, developing nations, and competitive immigrant families, the alternative to suffering is not leisure, it is failure. It is destitution. When Prop attacks this narrative, they're attacking the coping mechanism without removing the source of the pain. They tell the poor students studying by candlelight that their suffering isn't required. If that student believes them and stops suffering, they can't even do that. And they don't get rest. They get trapped in the cycle of poverty. They also argue that this narrative allows systems to be oppressive because it shifts the blame to the individual. They say that if you just worked harder, you'd succeed, which lets the government off the hook. This is like a misdiagnosis. People in these communities are not naive. They know the system is rigged. The narrative of resilience doesn't bind them to oppression. It empowers them to navigate it despite the oppression. Removing the narrative doesn't suddenly make the government competent. It just leaves the individual feeling helpless. If suffering isn't the path to success, then their current suffering is meaningless. And that is a far more dangerous psychological state for them to have. Second, Prop's argument that systemic failure makes the narrative of hard work alive is a privileged simplification that robs the poor of their only effective tool. While it is true that systems like the Gaokao are imperfect and favored towards the wealthy in a certain way, they remain the least worst alternative to systems based purely on nepotism and bribery. Without the cultural drive to eat bitterness and endure academic hardship, the poor would lose their only mechanism to outcompete the rich. Furthermore, citing remaining in nations like China ignores the historical reality that this exact work ethic is what lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese people out of destitution in mere decades. And by telling the poor the system is rigged and their effort is futile, prop offers the paralysis of victimhood rather than like the agency to improve their own lives. Therefore, prop concedes that on both sides, oppression and poverty cannot be solved. What we do is give you a way to deal with it, to push through it, and make sure you survive in the first place. Now, onto my substantives. First speaker has already explained why this narrative emerges in poor communities, because it is effective. She also explained how removing it leads to desperate measures like crime. I'm going to extend this asking, if we remove this narrative, what replaces it? My first argument will be on like the structural failure of alternative narratives as they want to propose. First of all, prop champions narratives like work smart, not hard in their first speech. This is a narrative of leverage. To work smart, you need resources to leverage. You need like capital, you need connections, you need technology, or like you need a safety net that allows you to take risks. For a marginalized person, like a refugee or a student in an underfunded school, they possess like zero leverage. They have no capital, they have no connections. The only asset they own is their capacity for labor and their capacity to endure pain for long hours and physical effort. And when you tell a poor person, don't suffer, just work smart, you are mocking them. You are telling them to use tools they do not have. The suffering narrative is the only one that acknowledges that for those with nothing, raw effort is the only thing that they can trade for a better life. Second of all, on the talent narrative, the other alternative is a narrative of talent or like genius. This is far more toxic. If success is about like innate talent, then you either have it or you don't. It is like static. The suffering and hard work narrative is democratic. It tells its child, you might not be the smartest, but you might not be the richest, but if you can outlast them, you can win. This is like a very accessible path. And if we replace suffering with talent or luck, we tell the vast majority of the population that they are doomed before they even begin. Now, my second argument extends like my partner's point. She spoke about people turning to crime. I want to talk about something more pervasive, like the lottery mindset. First of all, why this is true. If we accept Prop's role where suffering is not required for success, then how do we explain success? If it's not hard work and sacrifice, it must be luck, privilege, or systemic error. While this might be like sociologically true in some cases, adopting this as a personal life philosophy is like really catastrophic for the individual. Onto analysis, when you remove the link between pain and payoff, you create a lottery mindset. People stop building slowly. They start waiting to be saved. They wait for a government handout, like a lucky break or like a viral moment. But more importantly, it creates a culture of resentment. If I believe that the person who succeeded didn't suffer, but just got lucky or had privilege, I don't admire them. I hate them. I view my own lack of success not as a signal to work harder, but as a signal that I am the victim. And it just doesn't just lead to crime. It leads to like passive decay. It leads to a student who fails a test and thinks the test was biased rather than I didn't study enough. It leads to an employee who gets promoted and thinks the boss hates me rather than I need to improve. Who doesn't get promoted and thinks the boss hates me rather than I need to improve my skills. And like first speaker also spoke about people choosing like violence. I'm telling you about people choosing nothing. They simply give up. They disengage from the economy and society because they have been taught that their effort changes nothing. Onto impact. The impact here is a total loss of like control. This is like the psychological term for like believing you have like the power over your own life. The narrative that suffering is required is the ultimate assertion of control. It says that I can change my reality through my endurance. Prop's world creates like a really permanent underclass of people who are psychologically conditioned to believe they're just like passengers in their own life, waiting for a bus that will never come. Now, onto the comparative. Let's be precise about this. We are not arguing for a world where we glorify burnout in Silicon Valley and tech worlds. We are willing to concede that in highly privileged, secure environments, this narrative can be dialed back. However, the motion is a blanket opposition to the narrative. This means we are debating the general principle. Prop's world is one where we tell society, you shouldn't have to suffer to succeed. In Prop's world, where a person hits a wall, when like the math problem is too hard, or when the like training is too grueling, they stop conditioned to think something is wrong, this shouldn't be happening. They stop. In our world, when they hit that wall, they think this is the price, I am paying it, and they push through. Now, at the end of the day, the narrative that suffering is required for success, not a lie, is not a lie told by the rich to exploit the poor. It is a truth discovered by the poor to survive the world. It is a story that keeps the lights on, like when the rest of the world is dim. It is a story that keeps like a father working 2 jobs rather than waiting for a handout. To oppose this narrative is to misunderstand the nature of the world for the majority of its inhabitants. It is a luxury belief, an idea that sounds good in a university seminar, or sounds even good in this debate room where we are all incredibly privileged. But it results in a harsh reality of a struggling community. We defend this narrative not because we love suffering, but because we value the resilience, the hope, and the agency it provides, which is why this motion must and will fall. Proud to oppose. Thank you.
Vaccines build resilience through controlled exposure. I think the opposition's narrative of suffering is like giving someone the full dose of a disease and then celebrating that one Renato that survives and now pushing everyone else down the same path. So the first thing I want to handle is when opposition repeatedly says that suffering is necessary for success, as in it's like the only thing that can motivate lower SES, I guess, and underprivileged individuals to like achieve success and push through, I guess. First of all, it's unclear why like the only incentive to make them like chase success isn't like an idea of just trying to be richer, isn't the idea of just trying to enjoy a better life. That has to be that like, I don't know, it's this like their situation is necessary for success. Do you know what this causes? It means that first of all, that like let's just have an intuition pump, right? It says like knowing that like it's like suffering is necessary means that you're less likely to problem solve for it. It means that you're like, oh, less likely to be uncontent with your situation and be like, oh, I want to problem solve this. I want to make my situation easier. That's clearly possible when you don't have to say that suffering is necessary for success, in which you just aim to make your life easy, in which you aim to just problem solve. Right. So opposition basically already concedes on Western liberal worlds in which like the narrative of work harder, work smarter is that work smarter, not harder is more prevalent. That we already just win on Western liberal democracies. We just take all these stakeholders, right? In which this narrative is a lot worse. In the second, so the only way in metric in this debate which they're trying to win is on undeveloped areas, and I'm going to prove why it's just why we win even on that. So first of all, we tell you this narrative is empirically false. As in, why is this false? I think it's like pain is not just a prerequisite. I think that's just not true. Like success comes from resources, opportunity, feedback, and like sustainability, right? Just because you succeed despite pain and suffering doesn't mean it's because of it. If suffering were required, then like privileged people would just fail more, right? And they don't. All right. So what does opposition say on this? They tell you first of all that like, I guess depression rates in Japan aren't due to boredom and not suffering, and try to negate a lot of our examples by claiming they're not true. First of all, if you're so bored to the point that like you suicide, I think that's called suffering. So yeah, this is definitely an example of suffering. And I think a result of this boredom as well is a result of people not pursuing other passions because they're told that like suffering is necessary for success. This like job is boring and stuff. You've got to plug through it in order to reach success. I'll take that later. The second thing they tell you is that this narrative is true. As in like, for example, Renato was motivated by his like, I guess, poor backgrounds and stuff like that. I think, first of all, this is incredibly toxic. Like, just think about it. You're putting the burden of your whole village on one child, right? And also, this just contains survivorship bias. As in, like, you only get told of the hero story of Renato and not the millions crushed by this pressure when they aren't told, right? You never hear about those stories. Okay, the second thing, right, is just it causes unhealthy expectations. As in, this is just not a valid example. Renato only got to here not just because he suffered, but because his like teammate, when they were trying to join Lisbon Academy, and there was like they had like I think the first person to score 3 goals or 2 goals would make it. His teammate gave it up to him and gave his spot to him. So that's just someone who sacrificed their story, all that pressure that got to them, and gave it to Renato. Also, Messi, for example, got life-changing surgery that allowed him to play soccer. It's not simply because of this suffering. Yes, I'll take that PO off.
What do you say to the person in a developing country who is starving and food insecure, who wants to be able to make it out of that situation? How do you propose they do that?
Guess what? You don't have to say that, like, I guess suffering is necessary. It's necessary to starve. The thing that motivates them is to not starve, which is not suffering. So that's what would motivate them, not the suffering that, like, oh no, it's necessary for me to be starving. No, they could just be motivated by the fact to make this situation better, which is to not starve, which is the opposite of suffering. All right. So lastly on this, then, I guess it just leads to inefficiency, in which we tell you people internalize and normalize this false narrative, as in people settle to do unsatisfying jobs, for example, in Japan, instead of choosing to pursue their passions. All right. So on our second approach, in which we tell you this just glorifies suffering and burnout, in which this creates a social expectation to keep pushing through. And I think this is where opposition tries to just like tell you that like resilience and perseverance are emphasized, and they actually gain that on their side. I don't think that's true, actually. Because just because you know something's going to happen, just because you tell them that suffering is necessary for success, for example, doesn't actually prepare you for it. As in, even if I know I have a dentist appointment tomorrow or something like that, I'm dreading it. It doesn't make the dentist appointment easier just because I know it's necessary, right? So you don't actually get more resilience and perseverance. I think this is incredibly bad, actually, because it neglects other things. For example, asking for help. Why does this occur then, I guess? We've told you how it's going to be perceived as trying to cheat success. It looks as if you can't stand hardship asking for help. It literally says in the info slice, emotional suffering is part of it. So obviously they're less likely to ask for help. It means they overwork instead of trying to improve their strategy. It looks like athletes ignoring their injuries and ignoring their mental health. It looks like not reaching out for support. It looks like athletes making injuries far worse for them in future because they keep on pushing through them in the instant. What does opposition tell us? They tell you already. I've rebutted how they tell you that like you build resilience and perseverance. This is just not true. Simply by knowing that you suddenly get more resilience. The second thing they tell you is it is a survival mechanism. I already told you it's extremely uncharitable for them to assume this is the only way to somehow motivate people from undeveloped backgrounds, in which it's just unfair, first of all. You shouldn't place such a burden on these kids, in which the success rate is incredibly low, right? And how, second, they tell you this is a coping mechanism, in which this is just not true, right? Simply as in if you're starving, you're feeling really hungry. I don't think the coping mechanism is to say starving's okay, I'm going to succeed because of this. Mechanisms should simply be, oh no, I'm starving, I'm going to try to improve my situation. That should be what motivates you. I think thirdly, though, on our last push, which will tell you, first of all, you get a loss of productivity. As I mean, it's much easier for companies to exploit workers when there's an expectation that suffering is necessary. It also just means people don't optimize, as in they keep on pushing and try too hard. For example, the 9 to 9 and 6 days a week culture in China. And if you compare that with Finland, like productivity actually just gets lower, as in Finland has the best education, right? And yet they only like work and study like 36 hours a week. All right. And finally, we tell you how this actually redirects blame onto lower SES, and they never get don't get as much support. So because you now run on the narrative that they didn't suffer enough, they didn't work hard enough, and that is the reason that they didn't reach success. Not simply because some people can't afford this suffering, which is actually tutoring and stuff, which is actually opportunities and not actually suffering. Right. So finally, it would just tell you our counterfactual narrative is better. This is pretty easy, right? On this third push, right, we've already won on every single Western liberal country because they just conceded to us. What does this narrative look like? It looks like probably not work smarter, not harder, right? And it focuses on good strategy and that suffering isn't good nor necessary, and rejects unnecessary pain as a badge of honor. As you hear so many people say, like, oh no, I neglected and like took all-nighters to reach success. No, it literally like makes your productivity worse when you do that. You need your sleep, you need rest. I think it looks like secondly, more healthier and more productive society. It means people look forward to coming to work because they're doing jobs that when they know suffering isn't necessary. They're doing jobs that they're passionate about because they decided to pursue their happiness and passion instead of settling for this like monotonous job because they are told suffering is necessary for success. I think overall this just means people live healthy and happier without self-inflicted stress. I think after we won all three questions, it's pretty clear that we've done this. Thank you.
Judge, we have already told you that to be successful, not everybody has to be Ronaldo. Not everybody has to be Adele. Not everybody has to be like the most popular musician of the time, the best sportsman, or the most successful businessman. We have told you in first already that what success looks like on our side is just to be able to live a normal life. This means that they'll probably be able to live a relatively comfortable life. They'll meet all of their basic needs, such as, having a stable source of income, for example, having a stable place to live, having a stable emotional connection, for example. But the problem is, Judge, in a lot of these poor and marginalized communities, this type of thing simply doesn't exist, right? A lot of people in the status quo, when they're born into these communities, they simply do not have a guarantee that they're going to be able to meet these basic needs. For example, their parents are living paycheck to paycheck. One less hour work means one less meal eaten. So we think that actually when people are already living in a state of suffering, when people are always going to continue living in a state of suffering if they don't work hard, if they don't suffer in the right direction, we think that our side is the only one that frames this in a positive manner. In my speech, first of all, framing, I'll take that later. And second of all, just one clash. Which side leads to a better world and leads to a more happy society in general? And I'll compare this with the comparative. First of all, on framing, they said that because we think that, this narrative doesn't exist in Western liberal democracies, we've already conceded on this stakeholder. No, we think that this type of Western liberal democracies and privileged societies is entirely out of this debate because this narrative simply doesn't exist there. They know that they don't have to suffer to be successful because they are already pretty successful, right? They're already like, my family's pretty rich. Even if I don't get into a good school, I'll still probably be able to run my family business. We think that this type of thing doesn't exist. And even in cases like Asian societies like Japan or China, they say that their counter alternatives is better. They think that, you need to be passionate about what they do. You need to do something like, focus on your family. We think that this is not true. And I'll explain why later in this class, because fundamentally, our model and their model is not counter-exclusive. So we think that the main point of the debate and the main contention should still be on marginalized communities, on people where if they don't work hard, they're not going to be able to succeed. They're not going to be able to live a fruitful life. So moving on to the clash, which side deals with suffering better, right? I've already told you that, me and my second speaker have already told you that these people are born into a state of suffering, right? If they don't suffer right now, if they don't suffer towards the right direction, for example, if they don't study, if they don't work hard, if they don't put in the effort to actually get a stable job, we tell you that they will keep suffering for their entire life. If you don't have a stable job, you're probably still going to end up like your parents, end up like how you were born. You're probably still going to be living paycheck to paycheck. You might not even be able to meet your basic needs. So we tell you that we are the only side that is able to frame this positive mindset. On their side, what they're doing is basically we accept defeat, we accept situation. Yes, we're being oppressed by the upper echelons of society, which, Judge, I might note that this is going to happen on both sides anyways because they don't have any mechanism that actually prevents this. So we are the only side that actually empowers these people to address. We are the only side that actually gives these people a chance to actually rise up against them because we are giving them a chance to break open this hegemony of social class. We're giving a chance to actually live a stable life instead of being constantly oppressed. Actually, I'll take that POI right now.
Do you think it's fair to place the future of an entire village or community on the shoulders of one kid?
I'll move on to that next. Also, we don't think that this will actually happen, right? We think that you are using a very extreme case of success when you're talking about, putting the entire burden of the village on this one kid, right? For example, we don't think every kid's aiming to be Ronaldo. Obviously, that's not going to be realistic. And we think that if you're just looking to go for a normal job, a stable job, to be able to feed your family, we don't think that this is going to actually lead people to put an entire burden of an entire village on this. And even on your side, you don't have any actual mechanism to address this. I'll get to this later. Because why, Judge? Their model is about finding your passion, yeah? Imagine this, you're a poor kid living in a rural village in Africa. Sure, you may love football and you might succeed, right? A lot of footballers have done that, right? But why is that still suffering? Because we tell you that even if you pursue your passions, you still need suffering to succeed. Ronaldo pursued his passions, right? He's great. He comes from a poverty background. The only reason why he was able to be so successful today is because he suffered. He went through all of the training. He went to training even if he had to forfeit school. He had to carry the burden of feeding his family, right? We tell you that even if you pursue your passion, you still have to be suffering. And even in the case of Japan, let's say, or China, yeah, maybe they're suffering in the wrong direction. Maybe, yes, work is very monotonous and very boring, but that doesn't mean you can't pursue your passion. But even if you do, let's say in Japan, you tell your mom, okay, mom, I don't want to study. I want to become a musician. Great. But do you think you're just going to become a musician with absolutely no effort at all? Do you really think you're super talented? No, we still tell you, and these communities, for example, no, if you want to become a world famous musician, you still have to suffer. Your suffering just comes in a different form of studying or working, right? We tell you that you still have to suffer by practicing your instrument 3 hours a day. We still tell you that if you want to be a pro athlete, do what you love. These are all things that still require suffering. So in the case of these marginalized groups, what we do is we empower them to give them an actual chance instead of accepting the current status quo. I will not be taking any POIs. And in the case of better off societies like Japan or China, we still recognize that, yes, maybe it is true that we need to pursue our passion. But either way, no matter what path you choose, suffering is always required for success. And lastly, they also claim that on their side, they focus more on family and emotional connection. And their example of Adele, right? This is extremely hypocritical, right? Adele was only able to engage in familial connection and focus on her family because she has the resources able to. Do you really think that a person living paycheck to paycheck, a person who can't even meet their basic needs, is going to be able to, stop their work immediately, work one less hour every day just to see their family? Obviously, we wish that could happen, but that is simply not how society works, right? It is unfortunate, but it is just a fact of life. And our side is the only side that actually allows them to do this, right? For example, let's look at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Even though at the very bottom, we recognize it is the very material needs that people need to meet. This is stuff like having food. This is stuff like having shelter. These all come before emotional connection. It doesn't matter if you have a great family. If your family is living homeless on the street, it doesn't matter if you love your wife, you love your kids, right? All of you are going to be suffering because you're starving, like literally. So we think that on our side, instead of accepting the status quo, we actually empower them, because if they're going to be suffering anyway, we want them to suffer in the right direction. And this is the only side that can do this. So Judge, overall, what have I told you today? On our side, we are the only side that creates a more positive mindset. And we are the only side that actually enables people to success. Because even if we take them at their best, we say that yes, sometimes you just need to pursue their passion. I've already told you why in my speech that is not mutually exclusive, and why even if you want to pursue your passion, you still have to suffer. So in these cases, and especially in marginalized communities, which we already framed as the center of this debate, we completely and decisively win this clash of who will live a better life. Thank you.
1. No preamble, first strategy, then stance, then our clashes. First, some basic talks of just some chats about how bad their strategy is. Basically, 3 points on this. First, the fact that they basically just kept asserting that mental health thing is just keep asserting their mental health thing without actually putting any mech into it after we have already proven that this doesn't matter. And even if it does matter, then we actually have the better things on our side, is ignoring the way the burdens have developed throughout the debate. We're talking about who matters here, and they're ignoring that. Second, they have huge concession because eventually, right? They start saying less and less on this mental health aspect and keep talking about where we say it matters. So we say that if their substantives want to have any grounding, they should not have done that. They should have talked about why mental health in these Western liberal democracies, as they talk about, actually matter. Third point of strategy. When we shifted this framing from, for example, Asian communities to the most marginalized, to the most poor, to the most food insecure, they still talk about these stakeholders as if they live in the middle class, as if they look like the rest of us and have the same things that make us stress. For example, like studying, and for example, like working working office jobs, and that is ridiculous, right? This is not what matters to someone in a marginalized community who is living in abject poverty. What matters is having food. What matters is having shelter. What matters is being able to survive. Now, let's clarify our stance. No one is saying that you must always suffer. This is completely ridiculous, right? What we are saying is that in order to push through and have hope, this is crucial, to have hope, you must acknowledge your suffering and acknowledge that you have to work your way through it, to go through, in order for you to survive in the first place, right? On prop side, you are only resentful of the suffering and you give up. Either you give up, or you start blaming others, or you resort to like things that harm people. For example, criminal violence. And they don't give you any solvency on this, and they don't tell you why that people are not likely to come into these to actually basically give up. So now let's talk about clashes. Really, the only question we have to answer here is, are people happier? Because this is what the debate has generally revolved around. So we have 3 points in this. First, on passions and Western liberal democracies, because we're going to take proposition at their best and say this is what matters, right? We say that pursuing your passions is not exclusive. You still suffer in order to pursue your passions. Think about Van Gogh, who underwent severe depression because his paintings didn't sell. This is suffering. What did he do? He committed suicide, right? We think this is just a net bad, and obviously he was even worse. So you still have to undergo suffering. This is not alleviated. This is just a fact of life on either side. What we do is give you hope. We give you a fact that says, okay, this is happening to you right now. However, if you acknowledge it and if you learn how to deal with it in the right way, then things may or may not get better. They might not. But on their side, if you don't have this narrative, then things do not get better at all, and you have no hope. And they also talked about like burdens, right? Guys, there's more than one kid in the village. Be so for real, okay? This is just really uncharitable framing, and we don't see like why this matters at all. Because if everyone works collectively harder together, this is what actually helps lift people out of, for example, poverty. And we've also pushed from first that being able to live and make marginal improvements to your livelihood is already it's already what success is. And we don't mean like you don't have to be Ronaldo. You don't have to be Adele, right? We say that Ronaldo is like the best example of this happening, but this happens a lot on all sides. Also, this Adele example just really knifes their own case because again, she's only able to choose her family. She's only able to give up her career because she had the resources to. She lives in the UK. She's white. She's middle class. Like there's genuinely like nothing stopping her. Like when you compare them to what we say matters most. Now on work, Prop wants to now on work and the marginalized, right? So Prop wants to protect the poor from stress. What we want to protect them from is starvation, literal starvation. Okay, they offer the comfort of knowing that it's not your fault, sure, but we offer them the power of believing that they can actually change their situation and get out of this terrible, miserable situation that they're living in. Yes, this world is cruel, but at least we give you the capacity to endure suffering, and this endurance is not toxicity to be cured because it is the only armor, the only source of hope that we have, which they have just really not dealt with throughout this debate. Finally, on the marginalized, we are the only people who empower them because on prop side, they have no way to alleviate the suffering. Note, if they keep asserting that this narrative only highlights success stories and give no reason why any other narrative is able to empower them hope and give them hope, this is a huge concession. This means they have no solvency on their side. They are not able to lift anyone up on their side, and everyone is just stuck being miserable. So proud to oppose.
I feel like throughout this whole debate, what opposition has obsessed upon is the idea of poverty. I think what they fundamentally don't understand is that the only motivator, what they fundamentally don't understand is people are successful without coming from poor backgrounds. What they've tried to prove here is that poor people are motivated by their situations and thus can leave poverty. We do not see how this doesn't happen under our side of the world. What we're talking about in this debate is when people from middle-class backgrounds or from really any backgrounds are forced beyond their will to study hard, to work 80 hours a week when they don't want to. When people are told that they cannot be successful unless they're working at the maximum capacity, unless they're working 100 hours a week. It is not whether or not people are able to put food on the table. We believe that poor people in either scenario, under our world, under their world, will still be working as hard as possible to bring themselves out of poverty. So that's just human nature. The fact is, what opposition has done in this debate is extremely uncharitable. They have tried to frame it under the minute circumstances of their best case scenario, and what they've done is they've not listened to any of the points or any of the examples that we have done. They have said that the Adele example doesn't work. They have said that, oh, well, Ronaldo got himself out of poverty. Well, I'd like to just firstly point out that, as we've said multiple amounts of time, is that for every Ronaldo, there's a million other kids that still live in poverty, that are still working as hard as possible, that still have their parents pressuring them to do better, and are yet still unfulfilled in life. The fact is, you do not get success unless you look at the root causes of these issues. Opposition has framed poverty as a moral test and suffering as a prerequisite for achievement. This is fundamentally wrong. Oprah repeatedly has said, all great people have suffered, or you won't, unless you have suffered, you won't be great. This is survivorship bias. We only see the few who succeed, not the millions across, for example, as they said with the Gaokao, rural China. The fact is, with basic resource distribution, there will be that one kid in the village. There will be that one kid who is slightly smarter than the rest, who is now have the burden of a couple hundred people to get them out of poverty. The fact is, we cannot just say that stress and pressure makes diamonds, because yes, that might be true for minerals, but it is not true for living organisms. People want more than just fulfillment through their careers. People want families, they want jobs, and they want happiness. If we're just to say that poor people are only successful once they have got themselves out of poverty, what about the people who just want a family, who just want a loving wife or husband, or who just want children and to be able to enjoy the time they have on this planet? What the fact is, the opposition has essentially framed the whole debate as about economics. They have said that if you are rich, you are essentially happy. If you are stressed, if you are under stress, that is a good thing because it will motivate you to work harder. What we are trying to say is that hard work is not mutually exclusive with being stressed, with having to work 80 hours a week. We are saying that success comes in all shapes and sizes. Success comes from all backgrounds, and it is not necessarily just these things that happen. For example, in the motion and in the topic, it talks about certain cultures. Well, what we see in the world as today is successful people from all different backgrounds. We see people who are wildly more successful coming from, I don't know, rural Ohio than someone coming from Tibet. The fact is, in this debate, what it comes down to is the fact that success can be achieved anywhere, no matter of your backgrounds, but it is extremely hard to do, and it is extremely unfulfilling to do so in a way where it is forced upon you to do against your will. We saw, for example, Simone Biles. She was celebrated for taking time off, for working with her mental health, and to say that I'm not going to pursue success just to tarnish my health. What we are trying to convince you of in this debate, and what we have successfully done, is the fact that success is not mutually exclusive with coming from, as the opposition has said, just poor backgrounds. Please vote with government. Thank you.